Peace, family. It took all day, but I'm here. All right, I'll just say some people a little pissed right now. Okay. Um, Shout out to Taz for his presentation that he did. It made me kind of think about. Uh, Kind of made me say some people pissed because them Proud Boy statements been floating around here, and we know that some of these so-called Irish folks are those folks. Even though that wasn't my trajectory, I wanted some of us folks that look like us to admit that they were Scots and Irish and all this stuff. But that'll come in time. Okay. Um, yeah, I'm gonna say that my post that I did earlier this morning was right on point. After listening to at least half of Taz, I just couldn't take no more. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be pissed off in a minute. Um, but let's get to this reading and see how much we can get done tonight. Um, First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start in chapter number 6, which was the Tudor colonist. We did finish this chapter, but I'm going to start at the last paragraph. It looks like this chapter that we're going into is going to start with the flight of the earls. Okay. And then it looks like chapter number 8, uh, it's going to mention America. Okay. Now, is this book going to set us squarely in America? No, but it's going to clarify a few things of uh, who did what when they got over here. You're going to be able to see who folks are in this. Okay. Um, got a couple things on my mind today because this attack of the black woman is really a problem. And it's a problem in public with these white folks, as we done seen and has been said, and what was said today, and what other people have done in relationship to the shooting in Florida. But it's also a problem with the folks over here on our side that look like us, that basically adopt that same mentality when it comes to the sisters. Okay. Um, I'm pretty sure that some folks are regrouping right now for some shit. Okay. So y'all just pay attention. All right. So this again, we're reading from A History of Ireland by Peter and Fiona Somerset Fry. And we are starting our reading from the last chapter, last paragraph on page 136, Tudor colonists, and then we'll go right into chapter 7, which I think it lasts for about 30 pages or so. And it is called The Irish Dispossessed. Right behind that chapter, it'll be The Protestant Ascendancy. Okay. What I see just briefly looking at this is uh, chapter number 6 ends with the date of 1616, and we know that that whole 20 odd Negroes came over here on a slave ship starts in 1619. So we're right in that window of time. Okay. And I do know that people are trying to pull the energy from this reading in various ways. Uh, we'll just leave that alone. Let's get to this reading. Okay. So the last chapter, The Tudor Colonists, page number 136, last paragraph says, the treatment of Tyrone was generous. So generous it earned him considerable hostility from English officials. When he was commanded to come to London in 1607, his friends feared for his liberty and even his life. His son Henry, who was serving in the Austrian army, arranged for a ship to sail from the Low Country into Lough Swilly and Tyrone, with the new Earl of Tyrconnell prepared for an episode known to history as the Flight of the Earls. They collected together their families, friends, and chief adherents, more than 90 of the leading people of the North, and on the 14th of September 1607, sailed away from Ireland. After landing in France, they traveled via the courts of Europe, which gave them little help, to Rome, where they spent the rest of their days in exile. Tyrone died, aged 65, in 1616. Hey, DJ. So, chapter number 7 of A History of Ireland by Peter and Fiona Somerset Fry. The Irish Dispossessed. The flight of the Earls was a disaster for Ireland. As Tyrone and Tyrconnell had sailed away in secret, they were deemed traitors and their lands forfeit. They left a vacuum behind them, and Sir Arthur Chichester, Chichester, who had succeeded Montjoy as deputy in 1601, saw immediately the opportunity for extensive plantation that had fallen into the government's lap. He had been toying with the idea of a minor plantation in Cavan, Cavan, to be effected without, he believed, any injustice to the Irish or native Irish. Now the same moderate plans which provided for sizable pockets of English and Scottish settlement in the area, still left predominantly Irish, could be extended over the greater part of Ulster. He wrote immediately to the English council to put his enlarged plan before them. Then in 1608, a minor chieftain, Sir Cahir O'Doherty, Cahir, Cahir O'Doherty, O apostrophe D-O Herty, of Inishowen, Inishowen. Read that again. Then in 1608, a minor chieftain, Sir Cahir O'Doherty of Inishowen on the north coast, broke into sudden rebellion and burned the garrison town of Derry, Derry. The revolt was soon over. Within 4 months, O'Doherty was dead and his followers scattered. But the government in England had taken fright. Chichester's moderate schemes were pushed aside, and in 1609, articles of plantation published which removed most of the Irish to specially designated areas, rather as the American Indians were to be moved to reservations in the 19th century, leaving 500,000 acres of goods cultivable, cultivable, cultivable land, about a quarter of the whole, to be taken for plantation. Following along the lines of the Munster plantation, cultivable, never saw that word, cultivable land was designated as profitable and bog and woodland as unprofitable. The basic grants were to be of profitable land, with as much unprofitable land added as the grantee wanted. English or Scottish undertakers, the senior grantees, were to receive 2,000 acres each and to build a castle with the bawn, BAWN, or forfeited enclosure. Servitors, those who had served the government and deserved well of it, usually army officers, many of them Scots, were to receive 1,500 acres each and to build a brick or stone house with a bawn, BAWN. A third category, the deserving Irish, were to have 1,000 acres each. Undertakers and servitors had to take the oath of supremacy and were therefore Protestant. They were to raise armed men on behalf of the government if required and formed in effect a garrison. They were not to take Irish tenants. but to clear the unwanted Irish off their lands and bring in planters, preferably Scots, who would build towns and villages to form islands of civility. But the old story repeated itself. Neither English nor Scottish families showed any great eagerness to settle amongst the wild and dangerous Irish, so prone to rebellion, and the undertakers found it more profitable to ignore the articles of plantation and take Irish tenants. The Irish were industrious, used to sparse live used to sparse living, and so desperate to remain in their homes that they would pay almost any rent, however exorbitant. So they stayed, and such British settlers as did venture into Ulster found themselves thinly scattered among the population still predominantly Gaelic and Catholic. One of the most famous plantations was made by the city of London in the county of Coleraine, 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 later renamed Londonderry. The county's chief town, Derry, had been fortified and garrisoned by Sir John Dacre in 1600, and then in 1604, after Tyrone's defeat, incorporated as a city with Dacre as provost for life. Soon, however, he tired of the new city and it began to deteriorate. In 1609, James I persuaded the city of London to form a joint stock company to plant Derry, the town of Coleraine, and the county in between. In return for an investment of £20,000, the Londoners were to have the rich fisheries of the rivers Bain, Bann, or I'm sorry, Bann, and Foley, Foyle, a long lease of customs duty, and the opportunity to build a thriving export trade in timber, salmon, hides, iron ore, and other commodities. The plantation began vigorously and then flagged. Like so many city councils and corporations today, the Londoners seem to pay more for less than anybody else would. They poured money into Derry and Coleraine far beyond the stipulated £20,000, most of which turned into fat profits for contractors and middlemen. Their first agent was sacked for corruption after 3 years, but 10 years later, Derry and Coleraine were still only half built, lacking houses, strong fortifications, and inhabitants. Outside the two towns, the position was no better. The county of Londonderry had been divided into 12 parts, one for each of the city livery companies. But once again, the castles and fortifications were poorly built and the houses too few. Those colonists, mostly English, who were persuaded to settle so lacked confidence in their situation that they never stocked nor worked their land, but preferred to let it for high rents to the Irish. Some planters had several land holdings which they farmed out. Some were absentees and some even children whose names were to be used by their adult relatives. Although altogether, the colonists were too far thin on the ground to withstand any concerted attack or even hold off the Irish wood kern, who harried and plundered them insistently. Let me see what y'all saying in the chat. Okay, got you. The ranks of these wood kerns or forest bandits were being continually swelled. There was no class of Irish planter in Londonderry. All those Irish still on their lands were under tenants of the English, paying such high rents that they were gradually becoming impoverished. An Irishman with 100 cows in 1614, say, was likely to have only 20 left a dozen years later. Not long, mm, mm, mm. Not long after that, he would give up. and filled with hatred for his former masters, take to the woods. By far the most successful colonists were the Scots. They were tough, dour, or dour, D-O-U-R, hardworking and well prepared to invest their time, money, and energy into cultivating the land, building villages, and setting up small industries. The large colony of Scots settled in North Donegal, and there was a thin smattering of them all over the Ulster plantation. But the biggest Scottish settlements were outside the government scheme in Antrim and Down. The Scottish presence there was not new. Scots had settled in Antrim, only separated from Scotland by the 13-mile wide North Channel, as far back as the 13th century, when the first Scottish galley-glasses came to Ireland and turned the tables against the Normans. Most were from the West Highlands or the Hybrids, and when in 1419 James IV of Scotland ended the independent lordship of the Isles, the MacDonalds, or yeah, Domnalls, who had been princes there, established themselves as the Glens of Antrim and seized the route, those lands which lay between Coleraine and Ballycastle, erecting the Irish McQuillans. Okay, I appreciate you guys for being in here. I know other people trolling and other people are asleep, but it'll be here for them when they so choose to listen. Um, Page number 140. James, being a Scot himself, was sympathetic to the Scots in Ireland. On his accession, he confirmed the MacDonalds in their possession in Antrim, and later in 1620 made their leader Sir Randall MacDonald Earl of Antrim or Antrim. Sir Randall was a Catholic, which James did not normally approve of, and had ties with the Scottish Highlands, which James did not approve of either. The Highlanders had revolted against him in 1599 and again in 1607. But although the second rebellion was led by his uncle Angus, Sir Randall had welcomed the refugees from the Scottish lowlands who had fled to Antrim. They were just the kind of settlers James wanted in Ulster, Protestant and lowland Scots, and Sir Randall had set them up with farms. James also gave his support to two Scottish adventurers, Hugh Montgomery and Sir James Hamilton, who were busily engaged in private colonization schemes in South Antrim, North Down, and the Ards, ARDS. The country around Belfast was almost uninhabited when they took over. In the campaigns of 1602 and 1603, Chichester had, on his own admission, killed all the Irish he came across, irrespective of sex or rank. There was no one left to remove, and when the two Scots acquired the greater part of the O'Neill estates in Clandeboy, or Clandeboy, or Clandeboy. Okay, got you. Clandeboy. In Down, they were able to offer leaseholds of untrimmed wilderness to their lowland Scottish countrymen, who they brought over in large numbers. Both Hamilton and Montgomery were capable, energetic, and on the spot. Brilliant organizers who rebuilt old towns, founded new ones, established markets, built mills and harbors, and set up industries. Within a generation, Scottish settlers had transformed Antrim and Down with their prosperous, peaceful, and God-fearing settlements. But the Scots worshiped God in a different way from the English. While their worship was Protestant, it was organized along independent lines. They gave unstinted support to King James, the first monarch to unite the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland, but would not accept royally appointed bishops. Their church was run by ministers and elders chosen by themselves. For years, they were left alone and hardly noticed. Later, they became known as Ireland's Presbyterians. Okay. Meanwhile, positions were hardening on both sides of the main religious divide. Toleration is so grievous. Toleration is a grievous sin, said the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin in 1627, and 12 bishops supported him. Protestants were moving toward a nationalistic, uh, rabidly anti-Catholic Puritanism. They wanted their church to be based even more firmly on the Bible, with simpler church services, plainer vestments, and better sermons, preached by a well-educated and disciplined clergy. They wanted a stricter morality too in both private and public life, and less frivolity, changes which manifested themselves in the fashion for plain black clothing. Changes which manifested themselves in a fashion for plain black clothing. Little of this touched the Irish. The Protestant Church of Ireland, established in England in Elizabeth's day, was a weak and ineffective institution manned by Englishmen, with bishops chosen for their politics rather than their spirituality, and a clergy so ill trained and lazy they had no prospects in their own country. Very few of them spoke Irish. The services they took in were uh, the services they took were in English, or if their congregations failed to understand that, in Latin. Spencer, a Protestant himself, was highly critical of these English clergy, writing that they will neither for any love of God nor zeal of religion be drawn forth of their warm nest and their sweet love side to look into God's harvest, which is ever ready for the sickle, and all fields yellow long ago. No wonder that the sickle, when it came, was a Catholic one. Ever since the Reformation, when both England and Scotland had turned to Protestantism, the Vatican had made every effort to preserve Ireland for the Catholic faith. Missionaries had arrived in the country, and young Irishmen had been sent over to Catholic seminaries in France and Spain, later returning to live hard, poverty-stricken, and celibate lives, teaching the neglected Irish people. For years, the English authorities had let them alone, but after the Pope had declared it lawful for a Catholic to assassinate a Protestant ruler such as Elizabeth, Catholics had come to be feared. In 1581, recusancy, recusancy Okay. In 1581, recusancy fines and the penalties for celebrating and attending Mass were sharply increased. And in 1585, all Catholic priests were ordered to leave the country um, or be regarded as traitors. The priests went into hiding and moved about the country disguised as laborers and herdsmen and worked alongside their flocks as and the martyrdoms began. In the early years, there had been only two martyrs, both of them suspected of aiding Spain. But in the last 20 years of Elizabeth's reign, nearly 100 Catholic clergy were imprisoned for long periods or done to death, many without trial. The Irish people rewarded their priests who risked so much for them with a total devotion. By the 17th century, despite the laws and the lynchings,
Catholic priests were everywhere, in the towns, in the castles, the villages, the peasants' cabins, the houses of the gentry of the Pale, and the houses of the gentry of the Pale. The Old English, those English who were neither government officials nor newly arrived planters, sheltered them as readily as the Irish did. And gradually, the habits of the people changed. While funerals remained the most popular of church rites, many an heir was brought near ruin by the lavishness of an Irish funeral feast. Church marriages gradually came to be accepted as well. After the flight of the earls, James needed to hold a parliament in Ireland. Elizabeth had ruled almost without parliaments. Um, sorry, without parliaments. The government of Ireland had been a military one, and Irish parliaments had only represented the Anglo-Irish and the Pale. But James needed to pass acts of attainder against the Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell to ratify the confiscation and plantation of their lands and to give credence to the establishment of the English judicial system throughout the country. His ministers also hoped to put the English penal code against Catholics, which was particularly severe, onto the Irish statute book, if y'all couldn't hear me. Catholics were not barred from attending Parliament in Ireland as they were in England. There would have been no real representation of any section of Irish society if they had been. But first of all, the government wished to fix things so that Protestant members would be in the majority. The House of Lords did not present a problem, though all but four of the temporal lords were Catholic. The lords spiritual, the bishops, could outvote them. In the Commons, however, the Protestants from the northern plantations were far outnumbered by the old English gentry and burgesses, all Catholics from Munster and Leinster. They were now there were now 33 counties in Ireland, each entitled to return two members, and 41 boroughs returning one member each. The government decided it must increase the number of members returned to the commons. The only way to do it was by creating new boroughs, and between December 1612 and May 1613, charters were issued to 40 new boroughs, 18 of them in Ulster. In each borough, the corporation or council was to elect a parliamentary representative, and as people had to take the oath of supremacy in order to serve on a council or corporation, their representatives were more or less bound to be Protestant. When Parliament assembled on the 18th of May 1613, the Protestant majority was 24 to 12 in the Lords and 132 to 100 in the Commons. But the Catholics would not have it. They complained to Chichester, the deputy, that many of the new boroughs were no more than miserable villages not fit to be represented in the Commons, and then opposed the government sponsored speaker and put up their own nominees, a former judge who had retired rather than to take the oath of supremacy. When inevitably they were overruled, they left in a body, declaring that, quote, those within the house are no house, end quote. And the Lords followed their example. The Protestants were left in possession of the field, but the Catholics had won a moral victory, and Parliament was pre, um, prorogued 4 days after it had met. It did not meet again until October 1614, by which time 11 of the 40 new boroughs had been deprived of representation, and in two, the results of their elections reversed. The Commons were left with 108 Protestant and 102 Catholics. The bills attainting to the two earls were passed, and that medieval attempt at apartheid, the statutes of Kilkenny declared obsolete, as indeed it was, differences having replaced cultural ones. The penal code against Catholics was not even introduced. The government decided that once again Protestants must be brought into Ireland as settlers. The Ulster plantation still had a long way to go before it could be called a success, but the Anglo-Scottish population taking root in the north was the only sizable group of Protestants in the country. Another plantation schemes had Another plantation schemes had been mooted for Longford, Wexford, Westmeath, Leitrim, and Wicklow, and then dropped. Now they were revived and put into execution, but land could no longer be acquired by confiscation. Its owners had been far too cowed since Tyrone's defeat to rebel. So Crown lawyers started looking for loopholes in Irish and Old English land titles and reviving half-forgotten royal claims. Longford had once belonged to the Earls of Shrewsbury, Shrewsbury, but as they had been absentees in 1537, it had come into the Queen's hand. Elizabeth had confirmed the Irish O'Farrells in possession in possession, but James's lawyers found the O'Farrell's title wanting. A similar crown claim was made in Wexford, which had been in royal hands in the 14th century, and also to Leitrim. James, okay, James was a plain, downright experienced Scot, learned, humorous, and not immoral. Yet he believed that he was right in what he was doing. Even the philosopher Francis Bacon wrote of the nobleness of the work of plantation. James, remember I talked about Francis Bacon and what he said on the plantation? Yeah. James had no intention of totally dispossessing the current landowners. He wanted to carry out an operation rather like the old surrender and regrant, with a sinister modification. A landowner whose title was found defective would receive a replacement title from the crown, but only to 3/4 of his property. The remaining quarter would be kept for plantation. The Irish, hold on, you guys, let me move around a little bit. Okay, where we at? The Irish. Hold on, you guys, I lost my spot. There it is. Okay. The Irish and Old English nobility and gentry were naturally jittery as the gentry of Munster had been when Sir Peter Carroll had dispossessed the Butlers in 1568. I'm sorry, my headset is falling off my head. I can't lay that way. Let me try this way. Okay, maybe this will work. Okay. The Butlers, 1568. They already had a habit of sending one son abroad to train as a priest. Now they began sending another to the Inns of Court in London to study English law. Despite James's hope, few of the undertakers on the new plantations did anything to spread either civility or Protestantism. Like their predecessors elsewhere, they preferred Irish tenants and the high rents they paid to the trouble of bringing in English and Scottish planters and protecting them from the brigandage of the dispossessed Irish. Some were absentee landlords from the start, staying comfortably at home while the rents rolled in. Far more were new English officials, lawyers, or middlemen who, from the deputy downward, saw their work in Ireland as an opportunity to acquire cheap land and enrich themselves. In the Tudor era, Englishmen had come to Ireland as adventurers, establishing the first outpost of an empire in the 17th century. They were businessmen. For the first time, the forests, fisheries, and pastures of Ireland were seen as a vast, untapped source of wealth. Forests could be cleared and the timber exported, salmon, hides, and flax sent abroad too. And if the Irish could be taught modern farming methods, so they would abandon such primitive practices as plowing by the tail, wool plucking, and corn burning, what marketable crops the land would produce. Some of these New English brought about the aims of the plantation simply by the energy and dedication with which they pursued their business interest. During the 1620s, Munster became a Protestant province second only to Ulster due to the enterprise and ability of Richard Boyle, who became Earl of Cork in 1620. He had arrived in 1588 as a penniless adventurer, brought up bought up Sir Walter Raleigh's huge estates round Youghal in 1604, paying a mere £1,500 for them, and went on to build towns, found industries such as smelting and weaving, bring in English settlers, and became immensely rich. He married his children into some of the best families in Ireland and England and commanded 8 votes in the Irish House of Commons. In 1628, at the culmination of his power, he was appointed one of the 2 Lord Justices who ruled Ireland when the deputy was away. When James died in 1625, he bequeathed his son Charles I a war with Spain, which the English Parliament had enthusiastically voted for. It had been less enthusiastic, however, about paying for the war, and after the mismanaged expedition of Cadiz, when the English fleet of 90 ships was badly defeated, Charles decided to raise a subsidy from Ireland. The Spaniards might well follow up their advantage with an invasion of Ireland, he argued, and it was reasonable that the Old English should prove their loyalty always suspect because of their Catholicism, with a huge subsidy amounting to £120,000 spread over 3 years. By a kind of gentleman's agreement, they were to have in return certain matters of grace and bounty, such as an abandonment of recusancy fines, complete security, even from royal claims in any title to land going back 60 years, and a relaxation of the oath of supremacy for heirs wishing to inherit estates and lawyers practicing at the Irish bar. Protestants were still only a tiny majority, but they were the they were the undertakers, the major planters, judges, and officials. They could make themselves heard. Such magnates as the Earl of Cork saw recusancy recusancy fines as an excellent means of raising revenue from the Catholics without touching Protestants, and opposed what came to be known as the Graces, especially the 60-year clause, which inhibited New English land grabbing. The Old English had been led to believe that the Graces would be made law, but Charles was always ready to double cross his subjects, and when the deputy Lord Falkland called a parliament, it was found invalid and Falkland recalled. Falkland's success, I'm sorry, Falkland, Falkland's successor was the most famous, efficient, and hated of all the deputies who governed Ireland. He was Thomas Viscount Wentworth, later Earl of Strafford, a man of towering strength, courage, and self confidence, but insensitive and overbearing. You know how ironic it is that these names run out through America? Because, I think I lived on a street called Wentworth in Illinois, and I think, Chicago got a Wentworth out there, that part. And, Stratford, there's some places out here called Stratford and all the other shit that was going on. Um, but anyway, let's keep reading. In 1628, he had been foremost of the English MPs who forced Charles. Wait. In 1628, he had been foremost among the English MPs who forced Charles to accept the Petition of Right, which protected the subject against the king. Yet his views were essentially royalist, and when Charles angrily dissolved the English Parliament in 1629, Wentworth joined the court party. With such a background in parliamentary management, he seemed the the ideal person to handle the delicate matter of the graces and to raise the revenue. First, he had to find a balance between the Protestants and the Old English. Quote, we must there bow and govern the native by the planter and the planter by the native, end quote. Sounds like checks and balances to me. But it says, anyway, he had written while still in England. He would follow the old maxim of divide and rule. On his arrival in 1632, he flattered the Earl of Cork just sufficiently to gain his goodwill and frighten the Old English without committing himself to either party. And everyone remembered that, even before his arrival in Ireland, he had had Protestant planters in Fermanagh, clapped into jail for opposing him. An iron hand, the iron hand had already dispensed with the velvet glove. Before he set out for Ireland, Wentworth had declared his intention of building up the countryside, economic life, and revenue. He found Dublin, with its muddy streets and boggy countryside, depressing in the extreme. He described in a letter how he looked out of his window in Dublin Castle, a damp and dilapidated building, at a miserably old horse, fetlock deep in the ooze, cropping woefully in the filthy grass. Ireland seemed ripe for his practical and businesslike, even materialistic intentions. He was well aware of Ireland's possibilities as an island ringed with ports set in the sea trade of the Atlantic. Irish cattle, timber, hides, iron ore, meat, and saltfish were exported, and continental wines, brandy, and luxury goods. Um, English beer, cloth, and coal brought in. Limerick, Wentworth felt, could become a first-class harbor and Kinsale, a naval dockyard for English ships, and a revictualling port for the Spanish Navy. The tax he favored as a source of revenue was customs duty. Wentworth was not disinterested. In those days, the collection of the customs was farmed out. Those who organized the collection keeping a proportion of what they brought in for their trouble, and Wentworth was the chief farmer of the Irish customs. The deputy and all officials made money quite legitimately from such opportunities. Nor was Wentworth primarily concerned with the welfare of the Irish, although he hoped greater prosperity would turn them into a civil, rich, and contented people. Ireland was very much the second of two kingdoms. Her economy was not permitted to interfere or compete with the English economy, and she must remain dependent on England for some at least of her necessities. Nevertheless, Wentworth was a strong enough deputy to defend Ireland's interests successfully when he felt they were being needlessly damaged. He kept down the export duty on Irish cattle and sheep destined for England and ensured that the English horses could be imported without duty as the Irish bred need improve. The Irish breed needed improvement. Okay. But the burgeoning of the economy was still in the future. In 1634, he called a parliament that might put the Graces on the statute book. Wentworth knew very well that the petition of right had been pushed through the English Parliament because Charles had neglected to pack the Parliament with his own supporters, and he was determined not to make Charles's mistake in Ireland. James had openly sold Irish peerages, and Charles had created some too. So there were 40 more members in the House of Lords, nearly all of them Protestant, than there had been in the last valid parliament in 1613. About half were absentees, and Wentworth had the right to name their proxies. The House of Lords would be no problem. To win support in the Commons, he wrote personally to 100 boroughs and shires, asking them to elect candidates of his choice. Then, when he drew up the parliamentary program, he made money matters, the size of the subsidy, the government of the first session, and legislation such as the confirmation of the graces, that of the second. The interference was clear. A generous subsidy would be rewarded with the legislation the members wanted. The members voted unanimously for the subsidy Wentworth required. The Old English and the Irish, in the hope that they would ratify the principal graces in the next section, and the Protestants in equally fervent hope that he would not. The Protestant outnumbering Catholics in the packed Parliament, whatever their position in the country at large, had their way. Wentworth confirmed only 10 of the 51 graces, the rest being allowed only at the government's discretion. The two darling articles, as Wentworth described them, of the English, the 60-year clause which safeguarded their land titles, and another which specifically confirmed titles in Connaught, were refused. The Old English and Irish realized at last that Charles and his government were faithless, and there was nothing they could do about it. Wentworth held the common English view that only Protestant plantations could bring peace and civility to Ireland. The confirmation of land titles in Connaught was withheld because that beautiful but infertile province, with its rocky coastline and thin inland soils, had never yet been planted. Crown lawyers were instructed to search for the royal claim on the lands of the Earl of Clanricarde, who owned almost the whole province, and found that Edward VI had inherited the Burke lands through the marriage of Elizabeth de Burgo to Lionel, Duke of Clarence, in 1342. Juries in Roscommon, Mayo, and Sligo were threatened with the loss of property unless they did the government's bidding and allowed the claim. But when Wentworth passed on to Galway, where the Earls had his seat, the jurors, 10 of whom were Clanricarde's kindred, threw it out. But Wentworth was not to be stopped. The sheriff who had um, impaneled the jury and the jurors themselves were all fined and imprisoned. Troops were moved into the city of Galway and a new jury summoned. Seeing the hopelessness of resistance, this jury did as it was asked and found for the king. Nevertheless, Wentworth decided to punish Galway by taking half the country for plantation instead of a quarter, and as elsewhere. Soon after he heard of it, Clanricarde, who was 71, died of a broken heart, his family said. Wentworth had carried into Ireland the policy of Thoreau, which Charles and his ministers would have used in England if they could. And so Thoreau, mm, and so Thoreau, let us go and spare not. Wentworth had written to his friend, the Irish Archbishop Laud, Laud, in the administrative sphere, in the administrative sphere. Thoreau was the minute and methodical attention to wait. Thoreau was the minute and methodical attention to detail which had in Wentworth's hands made the Irish government efficient and the county rich as it had never been before. In other fields, it was a policy of force, a ruthless determination to push throughout government aims, whatever the opposition or consequences. It demonstrated Wentworth's strength and exposed his weaknesses, his blunderbuss tendency to go much too far, to earn him his nickname of the Black Tom Tyrant. Hold on a second, let me peep at y'all. Y'all quiet in the chat. Y'all quiet. I guess y'all listening. Phone getting hot. I'm gonna try not to stick it in the refrigerator and forget it again. Okay. But let's continue. We are on page 149. Tyrant or no, Wentworth seems to have had a genuine concern for the little man and the poor. He put acts through in 1634. I'm sorry. He put acts through the 1634 Parliament, which protected them from usurers and blackmailers, helped them obtain justice in a land where intimidation was rife, and supported small planters against the undertakers. But he alienated every other group. The Old English had been let down over the Graces. The Protestants had unpopular high church rituals thrust upon them, and in 1639 the Scottish Presbyterians in Ulster were made to swear an oath of allegiance called the Black Oath. Charles's autocratic rule had aroused such resentment in Scotland that the Presbyterian group, the Covenanters, had raised an army against him, and Wentworth was determined the Scottish disaffection should not spread to Ireland. Leading individuals were alienated too. When Wentworth examined the finances of the established church, which were in a poor state, he found much of the land set aside for it in each plantation. For it in each plantation had been flinched away again. One of the chief offenders had been the Earl of Cork. Through overconfidence, or perhaps through righteous zeal, Wentworth lacked, I'm sorry, through overconfidence, or perhaps through righteous zeal, Wentworth liked to attack the mighty, and he forced Cork to surrender much of the church property he had acquired and pay the fine of £15,000. Cork squirmed and wiggled and went to the king, but eventually had to disgorge over £40,000. Others were attacked and demolished too. Lord Mountnorris was made a good thing out of being vice treasurer, besides being one of those who, like Wentworth himself, farmed the customs. Sorry for my stumbling, you guys. Wentworth had occasion to deliver a sharp reprimand to Mountnorris's brother, an army officer, and Mountnorris declared loudly at a dinner party that his brother should stick a knife into the deputy. Wentworth ignored the remark for months and then arranged Mountnorris before a court martial, which condemned him to death. There was no likelihood that the sentence would be carried out, but Montnorris lost his office of vice treasurer and had an application to farm more customs turned down in favor of the deputy. Next, Wentworth quarreled with the Lord Chancellor, Lord Loftus, Loftus, suspended him from office and ordered him to hand over the Great Seal. When Loftus obstinately refused, he found himself imprisoned in Dublin Castle. But the great ones of Ireland had many English connections and got their revenge. In 1639, Charles, realizing the seriousness of the threat from Scotland, called Wentworth to England to help him. The mighty deputy had no friends in either country, and when created Earl of Strafford, he was impeached in the English Parliament, an early victim in the struggle between Parliament and the King. He found Cork, Loftus, Montnorris, and many other familiar faces from Ireland ranged against him. Charles had assured Strafford his life and fortune would be safe, but when a mob demonstrated against him, the frightened king, to whom Strafford had been the most faithful servant, consigned him to death. He was executed on the 12th of May, 1641. We are on page 150, family. Give me a quick minute to wet my throat a little bit. Y'all still quiet over here in the chat? Mm-hmm. Hold on a second. Give me a second, you guys. All right. Uh, so he was executed on May 12th, 1641. The Irish broke into rebellion. 4 years they had been smarting under the loss of their lands, the banning of their religion, the suppression of their language and culture, and their exclusion from government office. During the summer of 1641, plans were made, taking advantage of Charles' growing difficulties with the English Parliament. In October, Dublin Castle was to be taken, and immediately afterwards, the dispossessed gentry of Ulster, having lost almost all of their estates to the planters, were to lead a rising. The the plot to take, sorry, the plot to take the castle was betrayed, but the Ulster Irish rose just the same, and pent-up fury for years was released on the planters, mainly the English, but soon the Scots as well. Oh, excuse me. The huge, I'm sorry, huge bonfires lit up the night, and so that the bandits and woodkerns and the wretched, exploited peasantry could gather to attack and burn the planters' homestead, plunder their goods, cut the throats of some of them, make prisoners of others, and drive the rest half naked into the bogs and fields to find their way, if they could, to the shelter of the towns. Though many of the towns too had fallen to the Irish, Dungannon, Charlemont, Mountjoy, and Newry were taken in the first couple of days. Dundalk and Strabane a few weeks later. Horror stories swept through England and Scotland. The Irish were said to be intent on the murder of the whole Protestant population, and though the leaders of the rebellion never condoned its cruelties and excesses, up to 10,000 people were said to have been massacred. The government was taken completely by surprise. Wentworth's army had been quietly disbanded during his impeachment, and the two Lord Justices, who were rather feebly running the country, had to call upon the Protestant Earl of Osmond to lead their defense. Armagh immediately set about raising troops from among the refugees streaming into Dublin, but was timidly forbidden to lead them out against the rebels until reinforcements came from England. And they did not come quickly. The English House of Commons was reluctant to send any troops to Ireland who might end up fighting for the king, and it was December before the paltry 1,100 English soldiers arrived in Dublin. Scotland still had many thousands of Covenanters under arms and was eager to send 10,000 of them into Ireland. But this time the English House of Lords, which was royalist in sympathy, demurred, and it was April 1642 before 2,500 Scots landed in Carrickfergus, Carrickfergus and began to recover large areas of Antrim and Down and Ulster's captured towns. Carrickfergus is Carrickfergus. The leaders of the rebellion had given it out that they had the support of the old Irish, fellow Catholics who, like the Irish, smarted at being the only subjects in England not allowed to serve their prince. But the old English were by tradition loyal. Their ties had always been to the English court and nobility, and not, as was the case among the Irish with France and Spain. They would not budge. They would not budge. They would not budge until they found their tenants rising even within the Pale. Bands of armed rebels ranged through their lands, their Protestant English neighbors being driven from their homes, and the tide of rebellion sweeping through Leinster and into Munster. Then in August, the government, taking the common Protestant view that all Catholics, even old English Catholics, were traitors, summoned a parliament of Protestants only. The Old English found themselves cut off, lost in sea in a sea of disorder, without even a voice to be heard. And in October, they set up their own rival assembly, which came to be known as the Confederation of Kilkenny. They declared their support for the Catholic Irish Church, freedom of conscience, freedom of conscience, government by Catholic officials, the restitution of lands confiscated on grounds of religion, the independence of the Irish Parliament from England, and the repeal of Poynings law. At the same time, they declared their support for the king. As Catholics, they feared the Puritan English Parliament far more than Charles's milder form of Protestantism. Charles, now engaged in a civil war with the English Parliament, instructed Ormond, the new deputy, to seek a truce with the Confederates. If the war in Ireland were over, perhaps the royalist Ormond would bring his Irish army to England to fight the English Parliament on Charles's behalf. The let me do that sentence again. If the war in Ireland were over, perhaps the royalist Ormond would bring his Irish army to England to fight the English Parliament on Charles's behalf. The Irish War was at a stalemate. Unpaid government troops were foraging for food in the countryside. The Scots held Ulster, and Owen Roe O'Neill, the leading Irish commander, had fallen back into Connaught. In September 1643, Ormond signed a truce with the Confederates, and 10 days later, the English parliamentarians entered into a solemn league and covenant with the Scots against the king. In the spring of 1644, the Confederates and the Irish Protestants both sent delegations to Charles with irreconcilable demands. The Confederates seeking freedom from the Catholic Church and the Irish Parliament, and the Protestants wanting the enforcement of the reclusory laws and their own political supremacy reestablished. Charles contrived to keep up the hopes of both parties for the next 2 years, while the War of the Three Kingdoms, as it was called in Ireland, dragged on, the Confederates losing their cohesion as the old distrust between Irish and Old English reappeared. In 1644 and 1645, Charles was badly defeated by the English parliamentarians. He had to have another army at any price. He sent an emissary to grant the Confederates anything they wanted in return for 10,000 men, and secret terms were made. But when the bargain was accidentally disclosed a few months later, Charles was so deeply discredited among the English that such support as he still had fell away. In March 1646, Ormond managed to negotiate another treaty with the Confederates, which removed various Catholic disabilities and became known as the Ormond Peace. But there was a fiery and unrealistic papal nuncio in the country, Giovanni Battista Rinuccini, and he threatened to excommunicate anyone who accepted any terms, which did less than confirm the superiority or supreme authority of Rome. The threat was too much for the ordinary Irishman to withstand, and Ormond could not make his peace stick. In June, O'Neill routed an overconfident force of English and Scottish at Benburb on the River Blackwater and left 3,000 of them dead on the field. But then, instead of marching on Dublin, O'Neill led his men off to Kilkenny, where Rinuccini had taken over the Supreme Council of the Confederates. Charles had virtually lost the war. When Colonel Michael Jones arrived in Dublin with 8,000 Parliamentarian soldiers or Roundheads, Ormond surrendered the city to him and left the country. All Ireland was a kaleidoscope, a shifting sand. Rinuccini hung Rinuccini hung about in Galway until the Confederates asked him to leave. O'Neill campaigned fruitlessly in Munster and then withdrew to the north, and the Ulster Scots turned royalist. Ormond reappeared in Cork and organized some royalist resistance, but in August 1649, 7 months after Charles had been tried and executed, he was surprised with his army at Rathmines, at Rathmines on the southern outskirts of Dublin, and forced to flee. A fortnight later, 3,000 English cavalry, nicknamed Ironsides, came into the city under the command of Oliver Cromwell. How y'all doing in the chat? Okay. Page 153. Cromwell was a gentleman farmer from eastern England who had emerged in his 40s and quite without military training as the most brilliant general in the English Civil War. He had a forcible personality and strong Puritan convictions. Like almost everyone else in England, he had believed every word and every exaggeration contained in the horror stories of Protestant massacre, which had circulated ever since the 1641 Rising, and never considered the grievances which had led to the and never considered the grievances which had led the Irish to rebel. Ireland before the rebellion had been a blissful Arcadia, he liked to think, which only the barbarous and bloodthirsty Irish had spoiled. Like other Englishmen before him, even the poet Spenser, he believed the only solution to the perennial problems of Ireland was to extirpate the Irish, to root them out and destroy them, as the Israelites had extirpated the idolatrous inhabitants of Canaan. Ormond had withdrawn into Ulster after his check at Rathmines and deputed Sir Arthur Aston with a little over 2,000 men to hold Cromwell as long as possible in Drogheda. Aston stood no chance in the open field against Cromwell's army of 8,000 well-trained foot soldiers and 4,000 horse, all told. But Drogheda, built on heights at the mouth of the river Boyne or Boyne, okay, um, yeah, Bowen, um, and strongly walled, was an excellent defensive position. Aston expected to hold it until his food supplies ran out, but Cromwell was well prepared for siege warfare. He set up a battery of heavy guns to the south of the town, and then, on the 10th of September, summoned Aston to surrender. Quote, "If you refuse," he commented, "you will have no cause to blame me." The rules of war in the 17th century were clear. Both Cromwell and Aston, who was a professional soldier, knew that a besieged commander who refused to call a surrender risked the lives of everyone fighting on his side. He could surrender and expect quarter at any time until the walls were breached, but once that had happened, he could expect no quarter. Aston refused Cromwell's call to surrender. In a letter to Ormond, he said his men, quote, were unanimously in the resolution to perish rather than deliver up the place, end quote. Cromwell, Cromwell replaced his white flag of truce with a red one and opened fire on the city walls, which began to crumble and give way. The defenders put up a very stiff resistance, and it was some time before the breaches in the wall were big enough for 7,000 or 8,000 of Cromwell's men to pour through them into the town. They put the defenders to the sword and then streamed through the streets, mercilessly killing about 1,000 of the townspeople. Many may have been technical combatants who, in such a situation, would not arm himself with a piece of metal or stick. Wait. What is that? It's a question, but it didn't. Many may have been technical combatants who, in such a situation, would not arm himself with a piece of metal or stick. Others were certainly defenseless. One group, which had climbed into the church steeple, refused a call to surrender. They may have been too frightened to surrender and found their refuge on fire. Their attackers had made a pile of wooden pews beneath them and set it alight. Quote, "God damn me, God confound me," end quote. One of the wretched victims was heard to cry, "I burn, I burn." But Cromwell felt no pity. To him, the war was holy. When he wrote to the English Parliament, Mm-mm-mm. When he wrote to the English Parliament, he described the carnage as, quote, "a righteous judgment of God upon the barbarous wretches who have imbued their hands in so much innocent blood," end quote. It did not occur to him that some might think the bloodied hands his own, nor did he realize that the people of Drogheda were mostly Old English and not the barbarous Irish who had slaughtered Protestants in Ulster. In his naive response to the legends of 1641, he had provided the material for similar legends, which would foster in the hearts and minds of the people in Ireland for centuries to come. The rules of war governing sieges were intended to save lives by giving the besieged an incentive to surrender unless resistance was reduced. Cromwell believed the sack of Drogheda would prevent the effusion of blood in the future, and in that he was correct. When he moved to Dundalk and Trim, not Attrim and not the other Trim, but Trim, when he moved to Dundalk and Trim, the garrisons were so terrified they obeyed his call to surrender immediately, and when, with the north more or less secured, he turned south, the castle of Enniscorthy was his without a blow being struck. Enniscorthy, Enniscorthy. At Wexford, however, the Confederate governor um, prevaricated when called upon to surrender, hoping for reinforcements, and an unexpected providence came in the aid of the English forces in the person of a young Captain Stafford, who betrayed the castle which stood next to the city wall. The English set up their scaling ladders, swarming over the fortifications and stormed the town, running amok among the surprised and defenseless townspeople and killing more than 2,000 of them for the loss of only 20 men. Wexford had had its chance. When Garrison surrendered in time, Cornwell, Cromwell was merciful. The terms he offered were generous, and he kept his word. His religion would allow him to do no less. Okay, I thought I saw harm in there somewhere. From Wexford, he moved on to New Ross, bypassed Waterford, and spent the winter at Youghal, which is Youghal, which with Cork and Kinsale, or Kinsale, however you want to say that, came over to him. In the spring, Kilkenny surrendered, and then at Clonmel, he suffered his most serious setback. Hugh O'Neill, a nephew of Owen Roe, had reinforced the fortifications, and when the English assaulted the walls, singing hymns as usual, they were repulsed and about 2,000 of them killed. Oh, damn. You- I don't sing that bad to be killing folks. But anyway, O'Neill and his men slipped away during the night, with the walls still unbreached, leaving the mayor to surrender uh, pacifically on terms to a furious Cromwell. Yes, it said pacifically. Soon afterwards, Cromwell sailed from Ireland, leaving his son-in-law Henry Ireton, to mop up what resistance was left. The Confederacy was breaking up. There were still 30,000 armed men on the Irish side, almost as many as the English had brought into Ireland, but they were leaderless. Owen Roe O'Neill had died in November 1648, and Ormond left Ireland in December 1650 to join the new King Charles II. Limerick surrendered to Ireton in October 1651 and Galway in May 1652. More than 10 years of rebellion was over. But was it a rebellion? In its first instance, when the Ulster Irish rose against the government and the planters, it certainly was. But when the Confederacy swore allegiance to the king, and the king acknowledged their allegiance, the state of rebellion was ipso facto ended. The king's difficulties with the Irish Parliament had nothing to do with the Old English or the Irish. They had their own Irish Parliament and could not, even if they had wanted to, have taken the English parliamentary side. Ireland suffered the supreme misfortune for a subsidiary state of supporting a losing king, being defeated by the rebels who had overthrown him and then being treated as rebels themselves. The English intended the Irish to pay for the suppression of the rebellion and to pay for it in the only way they could, with their land. In 1642, soon after the rebellion had broken out, the English Parliament had passed an Adventurers Act, which declared the lands of the leading rebels forfeit and offered them for sale to English subscribers, the adventurers. With a curious blindness, the English were planning to perpetuate the wrong which had led to the rebellion in the first place. In 1652, with Ireland quiet once more, the act was put into effect. Ireland had suffered terribly during the years of the war. A third of the country's Catholic had been killed, and the population had fallen back into its medieval level of 500,000. The government planned to fill the emptiness with a massive new plantation covering two-thirds of the country. The counties of Dublin, Cork, Kildare, and Carlow were to be reserved to itself as a kind of piggy bank or nest egg out of which all its debts could be paid, whether incurred in England or Ireland, and its servants rewarded, and another 10 countries were to be shared amongst the adventurers and the officers and men of Cromwell's army, who were to receive Irish land in lieu of the arrears of pay. My head keeps slipping. The arrears of pay is right. Arrears of pay. Okay. Those Irish and Old English who stood in the way of this massive resettlement were to be transported to forfeited lands in Connaught. Ireland was to be divided, as it had been in the Middle Ages, into English and Irish areas. But this time, the English Pale was to cover most of the country and no more than an impoverished wilderness, rather like a South African homeland left to the Irish. The Cromwellian Act of Settlement, passed by the English Parliament in 1652, categorized the people of Ireland according to the constant good affection they had and had not maintained towards the parliamentarians, and deprived them of their land accordingly. Ormond, Clan Ricard, and 102 others were expressly excluded from any kind of pardon, along with all who had taken part in the original rising. Those who had fought for the Confederate Army were to lose two-thirds of their estates. Landowners sympathetic to the Confederacy, one-third, and others less diligent, one-fifth. All three categories were to suffer enforced transplantation to Connaught, where they would receive fresh lands of equal value to what remained to them of the old. Only the poorest, those with goods less than £10, were to receive a free pardon, not through clemency, but because the new owners needed somebody left to do their livestock and till the soil. Towns which had held Towns which had held out against the parliamentarians, such as Waterford and Galway, were to be planted with New English, and their burgesses moved at least 2 miles outside the walls. The transplantation was carried out with amazing speed and with amazing speed. An English geographer, Sir William Petty, surveyed and mapped almost the whole of Ireland in 13 months, and the Irish and Old English gentry and aristocracy were ordered, on pain of death, to be across the River Shannon by the 1st of May, 1654. Naturally, they prevaricated, hoping against hope for some change of heart in the English, and the date was pushed back twice, to December 1654 and then to March 1655. But then, mm, 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 by then, 44,000 people had been turned out of their homes and farms in the fertile east and south to May and south to made a long trek with their families, followers, cattle, pigs, sheep, chicken, and such goods as they could take with them to Connaught. They traveled through the wet and cold of the winter, some half starving because they had not been able to reap the harvest before setting out, and others knowing they would reach their new lands too late for sowing. Yet, mm, mm, mm. Yet, for all the ruthlessness of the transplantation to Connaught or efficiency of the Puritan administrators who, in the name of religion, carried it out, the Cromwellian settlement failed. One of its objects was to fill Ireland with so many Protestants that the Catholics would be swamped and eventually, lacking the leadership of their gentry and priests, converted. But the difficulties were the same as they had been in the previous plantations. Many private soldiers could not afford to take land in lieu of cash, and sold up immediately to their officers, who soon had far more land than the government intended. English laborers, artisans, and tenant farmers showed their usual reluctance to come to Ireland. The New World was far more attractive to them than the damp Papist island beset by trouble, and tales were already reaching in England of the Tories, men from the disbanded Irish armies who preferred to stay in their home areas and live by brigandage, brigandage rather than join a foreign army and make the long trek to Connaught. For a brief while, Ireland was united to England as never before, and English Protestant gentry wielded total power over landless Catholic Irish peasants. Catholic priests were banned and hunted, and iniquitous, iniquitous Cromwellian law offered £5 reward for anyone bringing the head of a wolf or a Catholic bishop, while the Protestant church reorganized itself with fresh vigor. Trading restrictions were removed, greatly to the benefit of Irish commerce, and the Irish Parliament were merged into the English. Then in 1658, Cromwell died, and the Commonwealth he had created fell to pieces. In May 1660, Charles II was brought back from exile and proclaimed king. Ireland's royalty, I'm sorry, Ireland's royalists had been too crushed to play a part in his restoration, but nevertheless hoped for some redress of their wrongs. As Charles, pleasure loving, tolerant, and a Catholic sympathizer, gave them what he could. Here it is, y'all. Here's part of it. The SESKV Act. Yeah, here it is right here. In 1666, one third of the lands granted to the adventurers and Cromwell's soldiers were returned, and Catholics freed from persecution, retaining their right to vote, though not to sit in the revived Parliament. The Presbyterians were helped with a rigum donum, a royal grant of £600 a year paid from 1672. But Charles made it clear that while his justice, as he said, was for every man, his favor must be given to the Protestant subjects and the Protestant positions maintained by the New English Protestant. I'm sorry, but the New English Protestants soon found out what it meant to live in a second kingdom. In 1666, Cromwellian free trade gave way before the jealousy of English farmers, and an Irish Cattle Act was passed, which cut back Irish livestock exports. The only sizable Irish export left after 25 years of war and disruption, until the price of a beef animal in Ireland fell from 40s, probably shillings or something, I don't know, 40s to 20s. I mean to 12s, from 40s to 20s. I'll just put it like that. I'm sorry, from 40s to 12s. My apologies. And in 1663, let me check the chat. Okay. Um, and in 1663 and 1670, British Navigation Acts decreed that all Irish goods destined for America must be carried in English ships. Ireland was not to share in the prosperity generated by the British Empire. That little part right there, British Navigation Acts and goods couldn't be carried in English ship. I think you can find a reference to that in the Crucible of Power, probably volume 1, possibly volume 1. Okay. Anyway, towards the end of his reign, Charles began preparing the ground for the ascension of his Catholic brother James. In Ireland, Richard Talbot, a leading Catholic, was given the task of replacing Protestants by Catholics in the army, the administration, and the judic- judicature. 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 Okay, got it. When Charles died early in 1685 and his brother um, became James II, Ireland's Catholics were ready to change and jubilant. They felt their time had come. But the English had had difficulty putting up with James as heir to the throne, and he was not to last long as king. He was honest, a trifle slow witted, and far too tolerant for his times. He could not believe in the strength of English anti Catholic feelings. When he tried to force the Catholic design upon England, leading Englishmen wrote secretly to his Protestant son in law, the Dutch Prince William of Orange, inviting him to invade the country and take the crown. In November, shout out to William of Orange over there, okay, over here, there, never mind. Um, inviting him to, okay. In November 1688, William sailed up the English Channel with 15,000 men, landed in Devon, and waited for the English to come to him. If they had not done so, he would have sailed away again, but there was a rising in the north in his favor, and the Protestants in James's army deserted him. Early in 1689, William and his wife, James's daughter Mary, were proclaimed joint sovereigns in England, Scotland, and Ireland, while James escaped to France. James intended to make his stand in Ireland, and in March he landed in Cork, bringing with him French officers, money, and supplies. Richard Talbot, who had been raised to the peerage as Earl of Tyrconnell, or Tyrconnell, okay, on James's ascension, was now the deputy, and James proceeded to Dublin, where Tyrconnell provided him with troops. Then he led his army to the city of Londonderry. Londonderry had shown its Protestant colors as early as September 1688, when the apprentices, the working lads of the city, had closed the gates against the Catholic Earl of Antrim and his men. Later, when Tyrconnell had most unwisely withdrawn whole regiments from the north, the Protestant gentry had raised levies in support of William. Tyrconnell, which is Tyrconnell, Tyrconnell had defeated them in a confused engagement known as the Break of Dromore. The Break of Dromore, Dromore, whereupon those who could not get a sea passage away from the country had crowded as refugees into the garrison town of Enniskillen in Fermanagh and into Londonderry. James, beneath the city walls, called repeatedly upon the citizens to surrender, promising them a free pardon for their rebellion. Although the governor was ready to make terms, the feeling in the city was overwhelmingly in favor of resistance. The governor was overthrown and James's terms rejected. The city prepared for a siege. The besiegers had no chance of taking the city by assault. James's troops were untried and ill-equipped. They had no spades and shovels for mining the city walls and no guns heavy enough to breach them. They could only wait until the defenders were starved into submission. Refugees had swelled the population into 30,000 and food supplies soon began to run out. People were dying of starvation and the garrison was too weak to fight. The governor had been replaced by two Protestant stalwarts, Major Henry Baker and a country clergyman, George Walker, who refused to make terms. Then, in the middle of June, 6 weeks after the siege had begun, an English fleet arrived in Lowfall or Foley, Loughfoyle, to relieve the city. But James's troops had blocked the river Foley before it reached the city with a massive wooden boom which stretched right across it. The English ship cast anchor and for 6 weeks simply sat there within the sight of the city, tantalizingly idle. And then on the 28th of July, when the people of the city had been reduced to eating cats and dogs, 3 ships filled with provisions forced the boom, and after 15 weeks, the siege was over. On the same day, Protestant troops from Enniskillen defeated an Irish force at Newton Butler, on the upper reaches of Lough Erne, Lougherne, and we'll keep going. James had lost in the north, and his Irish Parliament, which sat between May and July, while Londonderry was being besieged, deprived him of whatever political influence he had left. He had been carefully, he had been careful never to threaten his Protestant subjects with any alteration of the Cromwellian plantations or Charles II's land settlement of 1666. But the old English who dominated the Parliament had no such inhibitions. Gleefully, they removed all penal clauses against Catholics and threatened to confiscate the property of all Protestant landowners. This Patriot Parliament, as it was called, was far more concerned with righting its members' wrong than with the cause of his Catholic king. William of Orange had accepted the English invitation to take the throne because Protestant Holland was at war with Catholic France, and James was reputed to support the French king, Louis XIV. William thought James might lead England into war on the French side. In the event, James did not go to Louis's aid, but Louis did come to his. James was not short of men, though they were untrained and armed mostly with skiffs and staves. And when in the spring of 1690 Louis offered him 6,000 French troops in exchange for his raw Irish recruits, James accepted them gratefully. James was growing tired of the Irish and only too glad to ship 5 Irish regiments off to France. 10,000 of William's troops under the Continental commander Marshal Schomberg had wintered in Ireland in the spring. I'm sorry, let me do that again. 10,000 of William's troops under the Continental commander Marshal Schomberg had wintered in Ireland. In the spring, they were reinforced with English, Danish, and Dutch troops. Then on the 14th of June, William landed at Carrickfergus, and both kings knew that the decisive battle was upon them, decisive not only for themselves but for the future of Catholic Ireland. William reviewed his army of 36,000 men in County Down on the 22nd of June. Then he moved south towards Dublin, which was the immediate prize, and reached Dundalk. James decided to make his stand upon the River Boyne, and was only slightly outnumbered. He had had all winter to train his Irishmen, and he picked his ground well. He stationed his troops. Who is that? Okay. He stationed his troops within the curve of the river, about 3 miles from Drogheda, and close to a good road to Dublin, which was about 25 miles away. He doubted if he would win, and the road would help him to retreat or help him in his retreat. In William, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Uh, and the road would help his retreat. And William, for his part, hoped James would retreat successfully. He wanted to avoid the embarrassment of making a prisoner of his father in law. The day of the battle, 1st of July, 1690, was sunny and bright. William bombarded James's position with the superior artillery, and then the veteran Dutch guards crossed the river in a frontal attack, followed by Englishmen, Danes, French Huguenots, and Ulster Protestants. James's Irish infantry could not hold them, though his cavalry under Tyrconnell, now a duke, charged with relentless vigor again and again. The French had been positioned too far away to be of much help. They only lost 6 men in the whole battle, but they checked William's men sufficiently to give James a chance of a fairly ordered retreat. Dublin was evacuated, and Tyrconnell ordered the French and Irish forces to Limerick, while James slipped away quietly back to France. The war dragged on for another year. The Irish and Old English were fighting for themselves, their lives, and their liberties rather than the departed James and his cause. In the summer of 1691, Athlone in Westmeath fell to William's general Ginkle. Then James's French commander, the Marquis de Saint Ruth, fought a pitched battle at Aughrim near Ballinasloe, a to block Ginkle's advance on Galway. But he was killed at a critical moment so that the Irish, disheartened, fled into Limerick. Patrick Sarsfield, a dashing cavalry commander whom James had made Earl of Lucan, defeated or defended Limerick courageously, but with William's troop around the town and an English fleet in the estuary of the Shannon, prolonged resistance was useless. It could only weaken the Irish's negotiating position. Sarsfield procured the best terms he could and surrendered. The Treaty of Limerick, which Sarsfield negotiated, provided first and foremost for religious tolerance for all Ireland Catholics, the same religious tolerance they had enjoyed in Charles II's reign. Secondly, protection for James's officers and men submitting to William, along with the civilian population of Limerick and elsewhere, which had held out against him, and thirdly, the opportunity for Irish Catholic soldiers to be shipped abroad so that they could fight in the armies of France, Spain, and Austria. The century that had begun with the flight of the earls ended with the flight of the wild geese, as it was called, when led by Sarsfield, a greater part of the Catholic gentry and their followers departed into exile. Some nursed a romantic notion that they would one day return to fight for King James, and others sought more realistically for adventure and fulfillment in foreign lands. The Irish brigades formed from the wild geese became famous in the continental wars of the 18th century. The estates of some 270 Catholic landowners, some of them rebels and other absentees, were forfeited. It was the final blow in a century of confiscation. In 1603, when the Tyrone Wars ended, considerable areas of Munster had belonged to the Protestants, such as the Butler family and the Purvenu Earl of Cork. 25 years later, when Ulster had been planted with Scots and English, a quarter of all the land of Ireland was in Protestant hands. Woodworth relentlessly carried plantation into Connaught, and the Protestant proportion rose to 40%. Then the Cromwellian settlements took root. The Protestants came to their own 3/4 of the Irish land. In 1691, after James's defeat, Catholics had only 1/7 of the land, which they had once owned, left. Unable to follow the vagaries, of the English, when they executed one king and drove out another, the Irish found themselves, for their loyalty, dispossessed and reduced in the many instances to the level of dependent tenants and laborers. Okay, and that was the end of that reading. We read chapter 7 in its entirety. Yeah, it be that late night, y'all. Took me a minute to get back to this book. Um, Interesting little turn of events. I've mentioned the Cromwellian thing, but I never really knew the details other than a whole bunch of people got kicked out, which we see it here, not at the magnitude that it was in my mind, but hey, it is what it is. Some people coin it as you ain't got to go home, but you got to get the hell out of here. Uh, he said the devil's in the details. Got to know them details. Okay. Yeah. Because the information is coming out the way it is, I don't want to go into too many, little sidebar narratives of are these the Irish, are these black folks, is this, and I'm just looking at what is. Um, let's talk a little bit about the next chapter, which goes from page 165 to 188, and that would be chapter number 8. Okay, good morning, good morning. Oh yeah, I gotta take my butt to bed. I got some work to do in the morning. But just so you know where we are in chapter 8, this is the Protestant ascendancy. When we come back to a reading, we'll be dealing with chapter 8, the Protestant ascendancy. And the first words here, like the first words on the other one was the flight of the Earls. Well, the first words here are the Treaty of Limerick. Okay. And again, I see William in here. Who else is in here? I see 1695 in here. Some stuff about schools and children and educated and Catholics and Charles II. I didn't even know the wild geese was a thing. That was crazy. Flight of the Earls to the flight of the wild geese. Looks like a few chancellors are quoted in here, like Lord Chancellor John Bowles and the Chief Justice Christopher Robinson. Okay. Um, I'm wondering really how this is going to tie in. Um, I know what we've been told, I know what has been said, but I'm really curious as to how this is going to tie in. Um, let's see, it looks like it'll go into the 1700s. And when I saw the name Talbot in the last chapter, I couldn't help but think about a Talbot I know that is a Protestant, but I think that Talbot over here was Catholic. I might have to go back and read that. So I was wondering, hey, did you switch sides, or are you lying about who you are as far as, or were you lying about who you are, that person that I have heard of by the name of Talbot? Okay. San Bernardino County, for those of you who don't know. Okay, just skimming over. Okay. Looks like about 10 pages from the end of the chapter, it mentions something called the White Boys, Hearts of Oak, Hearts of Steel, and other organizations which followed them were not patriot or freedom movements. So that's gonna be a little interesting. I mean, I started this off talking about the Proud Boys and shit. I see the British Privy Council in the next chapter. Um, Yeah, we'll see what this one yields, because as we can see here in chapter 8, we'll be leading up to uh, the Declaration of Independence. I do see on page 185 they are going to mention America. Um, of course, the Presbyterians again, which makes some things come to light about what happened on the eastern shores over there with the Presbyterians, and meetings that happened to say Synodia, you know, without the light of day as far as the meeting was concerned. It also mentions the West Indies in here in this next chapter. I really would like to continue reading, but I have a lot to do in the morning. And just to tell you, on the last page of chapter 8 for the next reading, it does mention the American colonies in the last paragraph. So this is going to be an interesting little read, family. Okay. Again, we just finished on page 164, and the last page in this book, aside from all the notes they have in here, is 340. So we just about halfway through this bitch. Okay. So family, trying to honor my word. I know I'm a day late and a whole lot of dollars short, but at least we got that next chapter in before, you know, I got back out here on the road. So let me let y'all go so I can go do what I got to do with the rest of this morning and get busy about that work I got to do tomorrow. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. I know it wasn't a lot of people in here tonight because it was so late, but I think we did pretty good because we came in under 2 hours with this reading. Okay, so family, I appreciate you guys. Hope y'all enjoyed the reading. Well, somebody said they've already ordered the book and they're waiting on it. So I hope some of the rest of you ordered the book rather than just listening to people say shit online. Anyway, family, this is your girl Navi. I'm gonna get on out of here, take my butt to bed, get me some rest before morning. Okay? So peace, family. Go back and listen to it. Listen to it again, see what you hear. Maybe you'll find something that you can add to the table of the narrative and shine some light on something, you know? So peace, family. Y'all take care. Rest well.